Okay, it is a real pleasure, Janet, to welcome you here. Janet is the US Secretary of the Treasury, and my acquaintance with Janet dates back to about 25 years ago when she was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors after a distinguished career at Berkeley and then at the Fed. You were in the Board of Governors of the Reserve at the time, and she was chairing the Economic Policy Committee at the OECD. I happened to be at the time the chief economist of the OECD, and we had a number of exchanges and worked together. It was then the immediate aftermath of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. That was the first attempt to mitigate climate change. The original agreement committed originally 37 industrialized countries and some economies in transition, and the European Union, of course. And the commitment was to reduce greenhouse emissions by 2010, or 2012, something like that, by something like 5% below what it used to be in 1990. Without that, I mean, we have seen the trend that Professor Nodas just showed us. Well, without that, the emissions would have increased by, if I remember, between 25 and 40%. Now, at that time, the OECD was asked to evaluate the best policies and the related costs in order to comply with the protocol. And an inspiring and leading push came from Janet. Janet was able really to somehow push the use of the OECD budget in that direction, complemented by voluntary contributions by the Nordic European countries. And so we studied the forms of carbon taxation, different regulations, incentives, and for the first time, a market mechanism to trade carbon emissions that countries unable to meet the reduction targets could buy the rights to produce additional emissions from overachievers. Now, the adoption of an emission trading system on a global scale was considered a rather useful policy response to climate change, and it required really substantial international coordination. There were a number of evaluations that we made using new modeling techniques, some general equilibrium computable calculation models were somehow giving us a cost over the next 10, 12 years of about ranging from 0.25% of annual GDP to 1% for all the Annex 1, if I remember, participant to the protocol, countries participating to the protocol. And then, however, these costs would, on one side, be higher had we taken into account the rigidities in labor market, and on the other side, they could be substantially reduced if this global emission trading mechanism were in place. As Janet knows, however, the political landscape changes over time. Now we are in a favorable moment. It has been just said that the good news is that somehow we are all very much considering this to be the crucial challenge for this century, and really we have to act as quickly as possible. At the time, somehow there was mixed feelings, and with that there were important repercussions also for the OECD climate team. It had to suspend its studies, did not get any more the support it received when Janet was there and I was there. I left, you left, and somehow the lack of funding implied that most of the actions moved to the World Bank, only for some time after also the World Bank leaving their actions on climate change. Now, the In 2005, the European Union, however, started an emission trading system. It is still the largest cap-and-trade market in the world, but it does not work because this is a global phenomenon, and you cannot have it limited to an area of the world, even as large as the European Union. Janet went back to the Fed. She became the president of the San Francisco Fed and the vice chair and then the chair of the Federal Reserve Board. I returned to the Bank of Italy. And we basically had to face oscillations in the political willingness to tackle climate change over those years. Today, I think the climate as well as the geopolitical landscapes are very different with respect to those years, and thanks to the acceleration of technological progress, and some was identified by Professor Nordhaus a few hours ago, renewable energies are now well established and fast growing. However, neither the technological change nor the Kyoto Protocol have been sufficient to arrest carbon emissions. Indeed, between 1997 and 2015, which was the year when the Paris Agreement was signed, the energy-related carbon emissions surged by more than 40% on a global scale. And they've continued to increase since then, with a temporary reduction in 2020 because of the COVID-19 and the consequence of that, but with a return to the 2019 peak this year. Now, the global responsibility for carbon emissions has also changed dramatically, because in 1997, 55% of global emissions came from OECD countries. In 2019, 2/3 of global emissions were produced by non-OECD countries. Now, these developments have made the need to act even more pressing. In the previous sessions, we have heard different ideas to achieve a global consensus on a wider international carbon pricing system, how to increase research and development in the energy sector, and clearly there's been a substantial plea on, Kristalina was very, very pushing on that, on the carbon pricing and how to really act now rather than later. Agustin also said the same, and central banks really are behind that. Now, I would like to turn you the question of what role the United States can play in leading the transition toward a low-carbon economy. And not only, however, in your official role as State Secretary, but also and especially, I would say, in this occasion, as a leading economist worldwide, and given your experience on these and other subjects. Thank you, Janet.
Well, thank you, Ignazio, and thank you to Daniele for hosting us today. How appropriate to be in Venice. Even if this weren't a conference about climate change, how could we not raise the issue here? For all of us, 2020 was the year of the pandemic, but for Venice, 2019 was also the year of the flood. As you know, the canal waters rose higher than they had in half a century, and even before that, many of the steps and statues of the old palazzos, visible when they were built centuries ago, slipped beneath the waterline. One news story I thought put it quite well. Venice is a beautiful ruler, a city that measures our world's rising sea levels and thus the increasing impact of climate change. Ignazio, you and I have been trying for a long time to measure the potential costs of climate change and advocate ways to avert them. I remember, too, first working with you after the Kyoto Conference in the late 90s when you were at the OECD. We formed a high-level sustainable development group there to involve economic and finance ministries in climate policy. I remember preparing my first speech on climate change not long after the conference. This was March of 1998. The US Congress was holding hearings on the agreement, and the Clinton administration needed a White House official to testify. I raised my hand. I told Congress to think of Kyoto as a form of insurance for our planet. Wouldn't even a significant investment in transitioning our economies away from carbon be worth it if it saved priceless coastal cities like Venice, if it helped ensure we kept the world livable, and if we addressed climate change intelligently, the benefits would far outweigh the costs. In the end, we all know the outcome of that prior effort. Fast forward to today. Well, I recognize more ambitious actions need to be taken. I'm happy to report that the landscape has changed in the United States. President Biden is committed to reduce U.S. emissions from 2005 levels by at least 50% by 2030, and we're seeing a new consensus around a plan to achieve a significant portion of that reduction. It includes thousands of miles of new transmission lines for renewable energy, upgrades to our power infrastructure, and greener transportation through accelerating domestic manufacturing of zero-emissions vehicles. And with all of our domestic investments in climate, President Biden has committed that a significant share of the benefits will go to disadvantaged communities who historically have borne too much of the brunt of our country's environmental pollution. I also think the international landscape has become more favorable to making change. During Kyoto, we understood well the global challenge that climate change presented and the significant cost to the world of inaction, but we did not have the benefit of a G20 finance track then. We had fewer channels to coordinate across a broad group of countries on financial and economic challenges. By bringing together finance ministers, central bank governors, and the broader international community to discuss the economic aspects of climate change, this conference is an example of how far we have progressed in our approach over the past 20 years. I'd like to spend the balance of my remarks speaking about how the United States intends to work with our international partners on our shared responsibility to implement ambitious emissions reduction measures, because no nation can reverse climate change alone. This work begins with setting bold policy goals. We must enhance the ambition of the nationally determined contributions that we submit to the UNFCCC and set targets for achieving net zero emissions consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. As finance ministers, we must help to develop credible domestic strategies, laws, and regulations to meet these targets. The international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the multilateral development banks, can be important partners as we seek to design robust economic and financial policies to achieve our climate goals. Developing countries are particularly vulnerable to climate change, with poverty, food security, and health outcomes impacted by extreme weather shocks. In this context, the United States has redoubled our efforts around the ambitious collective goal to mobilize $100 billion per year from a wide variety of public and private sources to support developing countries in undertaking adaptation and mitigation efforts. This spring, we released America's first ever international climate finance plan. As part of this plan, the United States intends to double by 2024 our annual public climate finance for developing countries and to triple our public finance for climate adaptation. That would mean about $5.7 billion per year in climate finance by 2024, including $1.5 billion for adaptation. The multilateral climate funds play a key role in this plan. The climate investment funds scale up targeted investments in clean technology and other areas, while the Green Climate Fund remains a centerpiece of providing impactful climate finance to the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. Multilateral development banks are one of the largest sources of climate finance for developing countries. The MDBs to which the United States contributes reported over $36 billion in climate finance collectively in 2020. The MDBs are also positioned well to engage the private sector in developing countries. They can target support toward the challenges in the domestic market that make it difficult for the private sector to invest at scale by advising on policies, mitigating investment risk, and providing finance. We recognize the tremendous work the MDBs are doing in partnership with developing countries. We see the MDBs continuing to evolve their role further beyond the critical development finance they provide, including to help countries design green recovery strategies in response to the COVID-19 crisis, develop green bond markets to raise capital, and build robust enabling environments to incentivize private investment needed to meet the climate challenge. We expect that they will continue their efforts to increase climate finance targets, fully align their lending with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and discourage new investments in fossil fuel-based power generation, except where other options are not possible. But we believe the MDBs can go further, and I plan to shortly convene the heads of the MDBs to articulate our expectations that the MDBs align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement and net zero goals as urgently as possible. We also expect them to take steps to more effectively mobilize private capital so that developing countries can increasingly benefit from private sector pledges to support climate-aligned and sustainable investments. As leading sources of official finance, the MDBs need to maximize the catalytic impact of their support for countries seeking to confront a changing climate and to harness the economic opportunities embedded in the transition to a low-carbon economy. I know that the MDBs have the policy expertise, the relationships, and the financial tools to make a substantial contribution toward our collective climate goals. And I look forward to working together to ensure that these goals are met. The investment needed to green the global economy is enormous, and it far exceeds the scale of official finance. Private capital will need to fill most of that gap. This brings me to our initiatives to enable the private sector to better account for climate change when making financing decisions, which we will discuss in more depth this afternoon. There are some positive trends in this regard. Investor demand for climate-aligned investments, including green bonds and sustainable assets, is rapidly increasing in certain markets. I'm also pleased to see momentum building in financial institutions around net zero commitments. A threshold challenge, though, as you know, is imperfect information, understanding the risks and opportunities climate change presents. For example, the current financial reporting system is not producing reliable disclosures. We also need consistency of reporting frameworks over time, as well as comparability across firms and jurisdictions, providing the useful information that investors need to make informed decisions. Climate change also introduces new and increasing types of risks. The risks for more frequent and severe natural disasters, the so-called physical risks, have and will continue to become more prominent. Then there are the risks that may accompany the technological market and policy changes needed to address climate change, the so-called transition risks. The emergence of these risks challenges one of the financial sector's most essential functions, ensuring that risk is borne by investors and institutions well placed to manage it. President Biden has recognized that this is a major problem that needs to be tackled now. He recently signed an executive order on climate-related financial risk, outlining a whole-of-government process to assess climate risk to the U.S. financial system and the federal government. As part of this process, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which I chair, will assess the potential risk that climate change may pose to the financial stability of the United States. The executive order also made clear this administration's policy to advance the disclosure of climate-related financial risks, which we will also explore through FSOC. This will complement the work of the SEC, which is currently reviewing existing guidance on climate-related financial disclosures. Treasury is also working closely with our domestic regulators as we engage in international discussions to promote effective and consistent approaches to disclosure. These efforts build on existing work to improve climate-related financial risk disclosure, like the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and other sustainability reporting organizations. In closing, I'm pleased that Treasury is co-chairing the newly reestablished G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which will deepen the G20's engagement over the coming years on many of the themes I raised today. The working group has an ambitious agenda for this year. In addition to developing a roadmap that will guide G20 priorities for scaling up sustainable finance, it will also focus on 3 topics. First, it will consider how to improve existing international initiatives and approaches to sustainability disclosure and reporting. Second, the working group will explore the various tools and approaches used by jurisdictions and the private sector to align finance with climate and sustainability goals and develop recommendations to enhance how they work together. And lastly, the working group will help support MDB efforts to align their financing with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So let me end where we began with Kyoto in '97. We knew back then that climate change was happening and that it was an urgent crisis that demanded our attention and action. But it's been nearly a quarter of a century since, and we have not done nearly enough. We can't afford another 25 years of inaction or low ambition. As we transition to the post-pandemic world, climate change has to be a challenge our global community addresses collaboratively. I know I'm not alone in thinking this way. This is a group committed to combating climate change. We refuse to hand this problem off to the next generation. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you to make progress on this critical issue. Thank you.
Yes, well, I think we may conclude thanking you very much for these words. There are many instruments, and all of them have to be used to meet our challenges, our targets, our objectives, the net zero emissions by 2050, 2060, more or less, we are all committed. For the time being, the instruments are incentives, regulation, subsidies, and also cutting the subsidies where they are badly placed. We have also discussed, obviously, the bad word that Gillian mentioned a few minutes ago about taxes, but perhaps this is something that in a way or another we will have to, in order for the price mechanism really to work. We started with the emission rights. I don't know whether that will ever be achievable, but in any case, there are many, many instruments that we have to put together in order to obtain our goals. Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you, Ignazio.